So I'm now recording. I was hoping that you would tell me like you had a picture of yourself dressed up as a grasshopper.
No.
Sad. Welcome to the Sustainability Teachers Academy online. I'm Rob McGee.
And I'm Molly Cashin.
So we're here to teach you about sustainability related topics and to guide you in developing a project that supports or promotes sustainability in your classroom, your school, or your community. What we're going to do today is talk about sustainability problems, how you define what a sustainability problem is, how you identify a sustainability problem. And we'll use a specific example that comes from a researcher at Arizona State University named Ariane Cease, and she researches locusts. So Molly, do you know what a locust is?
I do now, but I didn't used to.
Okay, so what do you think it is? What is it? What's a locust?
Well, I know now that a locust is actually a grasshopper that has molted into a locust. So it's like you have the different life phases of a grasshopper, and then becoming a locust is like the last life phase, and it doesn't always occur.
Yeah, so like most grasshoppers don't become locusts, but all locusts are kind of grasshopper. And
right.
So we're going to take a look at kind of what the impact of this is. You probably know that locusts are referred to in lots of religious texts, from the Bible to the Quran, and they're seen as like this massive plague, right? This huge problem that descends upon people and sort of destroys their lives. And so we're going to use them as an example of a sustainability problem and see how Dr. Cease and her colleagues have tried to analyze and find solutions for that problem and hopefully make things better from the perspective of the people that are harmed by locusts in the environment.
So something interesting about locusts is that they are this like historical, biblical phenomenon. They've kind of always existed. These locust plagues are something that have always been around, but what's interesting now is that with the development of climate change, they're becoming more and more of a problem. So like they did exist, it had an impact, but now it's almost like the impact is growing because of the changes.
Yeah, you can even do a Google search, search the news items for locust plagues, and you'll see stories that are just from even just a few months ago. The most recent story that I pulled off Google was from like September of 2016. So there's still a huge problem that people face and that they deal with. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about sustainability in general. And if you're a teacher that's using this resource, you might not know what sustainability is, or you might have your own ideas of what sustainability is, and that's cool, that's good. We like to approach sustainability from a certain perspective, and so we'll kind of give you our definitions and our working definitions and our perspective on sustainability. But if you're interested in really developing this out more, there's a resource on the Blackboard site that is a primer of sustainability, and it kind of walks you through how we see sustainability and how we tend to think about sustainability and how we'll talk about it during these modules.
And I think it might be interesting if we also talk about how we developed our own sense of what sustainability is, because they might be really different of how we learned about it.
Right, yeah. So if you'd asked me maybe 3 or 4 years ago what sustainability is, I probably would have talked about how it's about making sure that the environment is healthy and protecting natural resources and using green energy and recycling. But I wouldn't have necessarily thought about the other elements of sustainability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm kind of the same way. I came here to ASU to get my master's in sustainability, which is when I really started learning about what is sustainability as a science and what does it include. But before that, I worked at an environmental law firm, and so it was my definition was highly focused on the environment, because from my perspective, the environment has intrinsic good, but also everything that we have and everything that we use comes from the environment, and that's why it's so important in sustainability.
Yeah, those environmental benefits that we get are called ecosystem services. In the sustainability primer, there's a nice description of those different kinds of ecosystem services. They're really important. So all of our food comes from the environment, the air that we breathe, the water that we need. Mm-hmm. And also the environment is responsible for cycling out our waste products. So the CO2 that we exhale gets cycled by systems in the environment, or the waste that we produce from food or from our, droppings or whatever, that in the environment would get, taken care of. We wouldn't have to necessarily think about it. So environment is this huge component of sustainability, but Molly, there's a couple of other parts of the sustainability picture. So now that you've kind of learned more about sustainability through your master's degree, like what do you add to that environmental component?
Well, here at ASU, we talk a lot about how it has the 3 pillars, or I like to think of it as a 3-legged stool, the environment, and then also society and economy. And those are hugely important and interconnected with environmental systems. So whereas before I got my master's degree and studied that here, I wouldn't see how something like the Black Lives Matter movement or political science even interacted with sustainability. Now I see that it's interconnected, and like the way that these different, seemingly separate issues are actually very interconnected, and those are sustainability issues, sustainability problems.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to have that interconnected approach, because a lot of times you'll see representations of environmentalism in the news, for example. There's a drought in California, and there's suddenly this intense need to ration water, even to farmers. And the complaint from the people who are impacted by that water rationing is always something like, you care way more about the environment than you do about our livelihoods and our jobs. We're trying to make a living here. We're trying to support our families. We're trying to get by. Right. And you're sequestering this water for some tiny species of fish that doesn't do anybody any good, right? So the answer to that is to have something like a holistic approach.
Yeah.
When you think about sustainability and sustainable development, you have to think like not just how we're going to make the environment better and protect natural resources and things like that, but how are we going to make people's lives better? Like, how are we going to promote their economic security? How are we going to promote social systems like community, or justice, or safety and security? All of those things have to go together.
Right. And so one of the things that we've talked about a little bit in the past at some of our in-person academies is how, especially that security component that you were talking about, how it, if you're not feeling secure, if you are spending your day trying to think about where your next meal is going to come from, or worried about how you're going to be safe during the day, you're not thinking about other issues like with sustainability. Whereas people that are more privileged think about, oh, is this a granola bar, an organic granola bar? These other people, they don't have the time or the emotional capacity to think about these other issues, which is in and of itself a sustainability issue.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a kid growing up in a community that's under-resourced or at risk, you may not have even security to know where your next meal is coming from, right? So how can you, as that person growing up in that community, care whether your eggs are cage-free or whether your milk is organic or whatever, right? You're just trying to get by, and so yeah, it becomes really, really important to make sure that we're treating sustainability not just as a look at the environment, but making sure that we're promoting social systems and the happiness and welfare of people, as well as their economic systems, having good jobs, being paid fair wages, and paying fair prices for the things that they need to buy.
That's cool. And one other thing that I think we should highlight is that at ASU, it's one of the university that bridges science and kind of this idea that the scientist is separate from the world, and then tries to turn the research that we have into something that's actionable. And I think that's really unique to ASU. Yeah,
that's really important because, some of the examples that you can find of sustainability projects or projects that seem like they might improve sustainability, when they're put into action, they may not be feasible or they may not be good ideas. And so there's a couple of good examples. Like, I'm sure everybody's heard of these like solar roadways. So this company developed this solar panels that you can embed into a road, so you'll be driving on solar roadways. And that sounds really exciting to people because it's innovative and it seems like it's going to take us in a new direction. But the reality is, like, we haven't even got the low-hanging solar fruit, right? We need every house to have solar panels, every business to have solar panels, and we haven't even got there yet, much less to start thinking about something as improbable as a solar roadway. It'd be nice if it worked, I guess, but what are the chances that that's going to be the best use of that investment? Right, and I think that kind of speaks to the things that Paul Hurt had to say for the Wicked Problems, Wicked Fast, about how he talked about how the energy sector is changing. It's one of the first times in history that the energy can be decentralized. Yeah, we should plug that podcast. So Molly's making a podcast called Wicked Problems, Wicked Fast. It's a very short, very fast-paced look at sustainability problems and the people who are working on them to make them better. So you should check that out. That's also in the resources for this and the other modules you'll go through. And it's awesome. And it's great. It's fantastic. Molly, you and I have discussed on numerous occasions how much we like insects. Like, insects are one of my favorite things to think about and to study.
Same here. They're awesome.
Yeah, they're amazing. They've got all these interesting colors and adaptations and behaviors that are interesting and worth looking at.
And their faces. You can just stare at their faces for hours in a microscope. I mean, it's...
Yeah, I think most people probably don't want to stare at their faces. But it's not like spiders where they have like 8 different eyes. They've just got 2 really big... Well, sometimes they have 4. They've got lots of eyes. Never mind. So maybe people don't want to look at their faces. But you're right, like, really cool features. If you look at their faces, like, you can sort of sense some like emotional content that's probably not there. But you should still feel bad about like squishing them, I think. That's a bad idea.
Momentarily.
Yeah, you might have to do it, but you should feel bad about it.
One thing I want to say about how cool insects are is that it's like you have a whole working system that we have inside of our bodies, and we're these big creatures, and like everything that happens inside of us keeps us alive, and it's like the same thing but like tiny, and also like kind of the same but totally different. And I think that's
like,
why it's so cool.
For example, their circulatory system is this just open, like, sloshing, sack of fluid. It's not. It has a lot of the properties as human blood, but it doesn't have any red blood cells. So it's just this, fluid that kind of floats around inside their bodies.
And they have ears on their legs.
If they're lucky, they have them on their legs. They also have them in a lot of other weird places. So there's all kinds of these characteristics that they share with us, but they're in, they're strange and weird looking when you find them on insects. So one of the things that I used to do as a kid, and I wonder if you did this too, Molly, is like, would you go out into a field with like an insect net or something and you'd try and find like bugs and catch them?
Yeah, when I was growing up, my neighbor and I started a bug hospital. We had a big cardboard box, and we made all these different layers in it, like a dollhouse, and then we would get bugs. Usually they were dead bugs, and we would like take them and like put them on little beds in the bug hospital.
That's both extraordinarily weird and really, really cool. That's so funny. So
I remember this one time we had a beetle in the bug hospital, and we were like, oh, we have to do surgery, and like now that I say it, it sounds like I'm like a psychopath. But we like cut open the bug, and then it had all these tiny worms in it, and we were like, we gave birth. We're birth givers. But that was my first insight into like, oh, bugs feed on other bugs.
That's pretty awesome. So one of the things that I used to do a lot when I was a kid is I would go out into the sort of desert foothills of Tucson, which is where I lived at the time, and I would find bugs, and I would find a lot of grasshoppers, right? And I would catch them, and they're really interesting. They have all these weird defense mechanisms that make them hard to catch and hard to eat if you're a predator. So I want you to think for a second, like, what would it be like if you were a grasshopper? You're this small, you're herbivorous but perfectly edible insect in this world of like bigger animals that are willing to eat you. So you've got birds trying to find you, and they'll eat you. And if you're in Africa, there's meerkats that will find you and eat you. There's even a mouse in Arizona. It's called the grasshopper mouse, and it runs around like with like little packs, like little wolves, and they find and eat all the grasshoppers they can. And then lizards and spiders and ants, and like even other grasshoppers will eat you. They've got this propensity for cannibalism. So like, what kind of strategies do you think you'd need in order to survive in an environment where you're trying to find plants, you're trying to eat, trying to make a living, and you've got all these other pressures on you?
And that's crazy. They probably don't have much time to think about sustainability.
No, they don't. Yeah, they're pretty low on the hierarchy of needs. They're
Right.
far from self-actualization.
Well, I mean, there's always, if you go back to biology, there are the basic needs that all animals need. So like habitat, a food source. I don't remember the other ones. Rob? What are the other needs of basic biology?
Don't go that direction. I don't know that.
Okay.
But just think of like, if you were a grasshopper, like, think of how camouflage.
You need camouflage.
Right, absolutely. Or, if your food isn't moving around, if your food is a clump of grass or a type of tree in the environment, right, you're gonna stay there and you're gonna eat as long as you can. And eventually maybe you'll run out of food, or you'll get discovered by a predator, or maybe some other species will try to compete with you for that food. But then you're going to need to get away and find some place very quickly, very easily to feed again, right?
And also mating behaviors. That's a really big need.
Oh, yeah, right? So you would have to be you're going to be hiding from all of these things that want to eat you.
But also available for potential mates.
Yeah, you want to have some way to attract these and find potential mates, right? But for the most part, if you were a grasshopper, you'd be you'd have a pretty lonely existence, right? So you're just going to hop from clump of grass to clump of grass or from tree to tree, eating whatever resources you can. You're going to be camouflaged, probably in a way that looks just like the food that you eat so that predators can't find you. And then if something does happen to come your way, a predator, a competing grasshopper, or something like that, you're going to have the ability to jump or fly away or maybe even kick at them with the little spiky legs and potentially get away to another place.
Right.
And so grasshoppers have all of these different characteristics that let them do that, right? They're camouflaged. They look just like the plants that they feed on a lot of times, or they've got spiky legs that and really powerful legs so that like when they hit you with those spikes, it actually hurts quite a bit, and that gives them enough that those legs are strong enough that they can jump away really quickly and then begin to fly to some other place. And I've even seen grasshoppers that are completely camouflaged when they're not flying, and then they jump, and all of a sudden they've got these bright under wings that are orange or pink or red or something like that. And so you're like looking for this red, brightly colored insect in the environment, and suddenly they fold their wings and they fall to the ground and you can't find them anymore. And I think that's kind of an interesting adaptation too.
What's interesting also, another thing I love about biology in general, but specifically about insects, is that they do have these specific adaptations that allow them to fill the niche that they need to fill. And so another interesting thing about grasshopper legs is that they're like spring-loaded. And so the way that we jump is like the opposite of the way as a grasshopper jumps. And I can't really explain that, but so the way that we jump is when we use our muscles, we're pushing off, but what they do is they use the muscles to hold it in place, and then there's a spring mechanism that makes them phew.
Yeah, it's part of their exoskeleton, so it's like a lever. So they pull their legs closed, and that loads it. It fits the leg into a little groove that stores this potential energy, and then when they need to jump, they just flip a switch basically and spring that leg open, and then they jump off. And it's really cool how they are able to store that power long term and then use it when they need to. And then it's also important for them to be relatively solitary. That means that they're going to be, pretty much avoid other grasshoppers, other members of their species most of the time, except maybe when it comes to mating. And so a lot of times you'll go out into a field, you won't see any grasshoppers because they're so well camouflaged, but you can hear them making chirps and buzzing noises and that kind of stuff that they're using to attract mates. And so the females will follow the sound and they'll find the grasshopper male, and then they'll mate, and then they'll go their separate ways. What if I told you that a locust starts out like a typical well-adapted grasshopper? So they're solitary, they stay put in their environment unless they have to move, they are camouflaged, right? And they're just basically eating machines, right? And then something changes in their environment, and they turn into these monsters. They become gregarious. They start to group together in huge swarms, right? They change colors, so they're no longer camouflaged, but they're brightly colored. It's called aposematic coloration. They're colored in such a way that lets other potential predators know that they're toxic, maybe. And then they start migrating. Instead of sitting on their branches and just munching away, they start migrating, and they'll travel, miles and miles every day looking for food. And as soon as they land into an environment, they just eat everything that they can.
One thing I think is very interesting about these grasshoppers turning into locusts is it's almost like a cancer. So they get up next to each other, or they start turning into locusts, and then the grasshoppers that are around them start turning into locusts, and then they start, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
There's a ripple effect that starts with small numbers of individuals, and then they all change into this locust type, this gregarious type of locust, and boom, it's an environmental catastrophe. So I did this quick back of the envelope calculation to give you an idea of how damaging a locust plague can be. Because it doesn't sound impressive when you're oh yeah, it's hundreds of thousands of locusts. You're just oh, it's tiny little bugs. What damage can they do? Well, think about this for a minute. Each individual locust weighs about 2 grams. That's 0.07 ounces. So it's not much. It's tiny little insects, right? But a plague can include upwards of 80 million individuals. That's huge. 80 million of these 2-gram insects. And every locust eats its own weight in food every single day. And that comes to a total of 423 million pounds of plant material every day. That's 192 million kilograms of plant food if you're from Canada. Lots and lots of food every single day, right? So that's hard to imagine how much food. So here's my back of the envelope calculation. Turns out that's about the same amount of food as about 529,000 adult elephants.
That's so many elephants. I wonder how many elephants there are like in a specific country.
So in all of Africa, there's somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 elephants.
So a one locust swarm can eat the same as almost all of the elephants in Africa.
Yeah, and there's already these huge conflicts between African elephants and farmers, right? So there's elephants get into their fields and they eat all their food, and they try to find these ways to strategize keeping them out of their fields without shooting them, because they're an important species in the environment and they're, at risk of extinction. But, essentially, imagine you're a farmer in rural Africa. You don't have to worry about elephants maybe, but you're trying to make a living by growing food in your farm, by growing wheat. And you look out into the horizon one day and you see this massive swarm of 529,000 hungry elephants coming your way.
All of the elephants in Africa.
Yeah, all of the elephants in Africa are making their way to your farm, right? That's the scale of the problem that we're looking at when a locust swarm forms. And so it's huge. It's unimaginable how much damage they can do. It's not just like one farm. It'll be, 10% of the surface of the earth covered with this massive swarm.
And that's just one swarm. I mean, there's however many swarms a year over all of the different continents.
Right. And luckily, I think most of the time the swarms are small and local and regional, but every once in a while it's like a perfect storm of environmental conditions and they become this mega swarm that just goes out, causes havoc, destroys every green piece of food, every plant in sight, and then eventually peters off and dies out.
Oh, and another thing about locusts is if two locusts mate and then they have baby locusts, if they have babies, the babies are going to be locusts. So you can't have I can't have locusts that have grasshopper babies. They only have locust babies.
Yeah, so once you have swarming locusts, when those guys reproduce, and part of the swarming behavior is that they reproduce much more frequently, those babies that hatch the next year, those are swarming locusts too. So it's this massive cycle, this huge problem that's hard to solve. So you might think that the change is some kind of a essential strategy for survival. Like maybe when food gets scarce in the environment or when the environment dries out or something, they band together and they just fly off for better resources.
That seems reasonable to me. That's exactly what I would think.
Yeah, right. It makes sense. There must be something that in the environment that triggers this, and this is their solution for surviving those change.
Right, and that's what happens with humans in human migration.
Yeah, absolutely. If a human group runs out of food in the location they're at, they're probably going to move to another place. And you can see that in bird migrations and other species too. But it doesn't appear that that's always the case for locusts. So scientists have identified lots of the factors that cause locusts to form plagues or massive swarms, but they don't always point to that swarming behavior being an adaptive response. So for example, it's not really clear that swarming together really helps them avoid being eaten by predators. It might actually make them more likely to get picked off by predators in the environment. And it's not clear that it helps them find a better source of food because there's not really a direction to their migration. They're not migrating toward, places that have better food resources or anything like that. They just sort of migrate randomly around the environment. In fact, there's lots of accounts where locust swarms actually just fly out over the ocean and disappear. So in 1988, for example, this huge swarm of desert locusts from West Africa flew across the Atlantic Ocean and ended up in the New World, which is a terrifying prospect because then what do we do if they become established?
How many miles is that? They just all flew together for 1,000 miles.
Well, Molly, it's exactly the number of miles that the Atlantic Ocean is.
Well, that's a lot of miles. I don't know how many miles that is. I should look that
Teachers
up.
listening, I strongly recommend that you, at this point, ask one of your students to do this for homework. I think that's a wise choice because clearly I'm not going to look it up. Way too busy for that. Anyway, so what happens is that each species of locust seems to swarm for different reasons too. So finding out the causes of the swarm has been really, really challenging.
And sometimes they can't find out. There's only a limited amount of scientists looking at locusts in the whole world. It's not it's a huge issue, but there aren't that many people studying it.
So I want us to think about locust swarms as a great example of a sustainability problem, right? It's really difficult to solve. It's going to impact the 3 pillars. So let's think about for a second, like how that's going to impact the environment, society, and the economy. So how do you think a big locust swarm impacts the environment?
Well, it seems pretty obvious. I mean, we're talking about, strictly biologically speaking, that locusts swarm and eat a bunch of food. So it devastates the environment, and not just, the farmers and their crops, but also any of the ecosystem services that we were talking about before. Totally devastated by these swarms of locusts.
Yeah, it's like basically like slash and burn agriculture for a huge part of this natural environment. So it's except without the agriculture part, because it's just locusts going out and eating everything to the ground. And so you may lose like an entire season of productivity. Maybe it's not even crops that you're losing, but productivity of the other species that make up that ecosystem. And so environmentally, this locust swarm comes in, eats up all the other food, and then what are things like zebras and gazelle and elephants going to eat?
Not to mention all the other insects.
And what about socially? How do you think that impacts, how do you think the swarms of locusts impact a society or a community?
Well, if it's devastating their crops, then it's obviously going to have an impact on the people whose crops it is.
Yeah, they may lose what they've worked hard to. An entire community might lose the crops that they've been working hard for years to produce, or for a season to produce, and that can be devastating to families and communities.
So Ariane Cease works on a team of researchers, and she works not only with other entomologists and biologists, but also sociologists and economists and a bunch of other folks. And one of the things that they have learned about locust swarms and the way that it affects society is that it predominantly impacts women and children, specifically female children, because they're the ones that have to stay home and then rebuild after a locust swarm. And so the female children, girls can't get an education. They tend to drop out of school in order to help at home. So it really is impacting. It's a very gendered impact, which we didn't know or expect before this research started coming out.
And we see that a lot with sustainability problems. They impact different groups of people disproportionately. So, a drought in California, for example, is probably not going to impact somebody who's living in $1 million house, but it's definitely going to impact somebody who's, kind of struggling to meet their water needs in a much poorer community.
Mm-hmm. That's definitely true. And then another thing with the gendered differences here is that so Rocky Rowetter, who wrote the book about ecological handprints that you will be reading for your first reading, or you maybe have read by now, hopefully. One of the things that he talks about in the later chapters is, in order to have a successful sustainability project in a developing country, is that he has a list of other things, but one of the things is it must empower women, because women empowerment globally is a huge sustainability issue, because it's like half the world that is not engaged in reaching their potential intellectually, emotionally, because of these, systemic issues.
What about the economy? So you might think it's just decimating like the farmer or the community who's trying to make money off of their fields, but think about the impact of losing nearly all of the grain production in Western Australia, which happened recently. That has implications for people worldwide. What percentage of your grain products have their origins in some other country? Almost all of them, right? So if those places are impacted by a locust plague, and that wipes out all of the the grain, then you're looking at higher prices for products that you use, like cereal or bread, or whatever you can imagine making with grains or with other plants that the locusts eat.
And not to mention, like, the companies that sell these grains that have been decimated, their company may fall off the map. They may not be able to exist or recover from a loss like this. And that's just talking globally. When we talk about the local farmers, typically the farmers in some of these more rural areas are subsistence farmers, but they also provide food to other people within their village. And so when these crops are decimated, now not only do they not have food for themselves, they cannot make any money to go buy food for themselves.
Yeah, so it just compounds the problem of losing those crops to locusts. And so there's other ways that we can think about this too. Ariane Cease, for example, studies what are called CHANs. Do you know what CHANs are, Molly?
I do. It is coupled human and natural systems.
Yeah, so what that means is that she studies the interplay between human systems like societies and economies and natural systems like the natural systems that are in the environment that might cause locust plagues to swarm, or that have an impact on the way that we are able to extract resources from the environment. So obviously this is a real problem for farmers, for native plants, for other animals that rely on the food that the locusts gobble up. So locusts are among the most important insect pests in the world, right? So in outbreak years, locust populations can spread across 20% of the Earth's surface. That's huge. And locust plagues attack food production in over 60 countries around the world. When a major locust swarm happens, it actually has an impact on the livelihood of about 1 out of every 10 people in the world.
So I think what's interesting about the impact and the livelihood of 1 out of every 10 people, is that a direct impact or an indirect impact? Because I think we could argue that as a sustainability issue, it almost indirectly affects everyone. And that's, like behind the scenes, something that you can't see.
So you may see a locust plague develop in somewhere in Asia, but that can have global consequences for everybody. So Molly, like most problems that are faced by sustainability scientists, locusts and their plagues are what are known as wicked problems. And so what do you know about wicked problems?
Well, I know a few things about wicked problems. They're characterized by 4 defining things, and that is that they are messy, poorly defined, and they are more complex than we can fully grasp. And finally, the 4th thing is that they're very controversial. This is something that all wicked problems have in common.
Yeah, and I think if we go through each of those sort of one by one, we can maybe talk about how the locust problem can be seen as a wicked problem. So when you say wicked problems are messy, what we're talking about is that they're often this huge tangled web of interrelated causative factors. And sometimes when you address one factor, that can actually exacerbate the problem because it impacts other factors in a negative way. And so every wicked problem then can be seen as another part or a symptom of some other wicked problem that you're not even considering initially. When it comes to locusts, you have all of these interrelated environmental and biological factors that make them arise as huge plagues and swarms. And so if you try to address one of those, sometimes it can impact, another problem. So maybe you're just going to take care of the numbers, so you apply massive amounts of pesticides and try to kill the locusts. Well, now you've contaminated crops with pesticides, or maybe you've exposed people to pesticides that can make them sick, or maybe you've killed beneficial insects in the environment like bees, or other components of the ecosystem are now facing a challenge that wasn't there before because you applied pesticides. So wicked problems are really messy. You can't really just target one symptom because it affects the whole system.
They're not only messy, but they're poorly defined. So wicked problems bleed into one another. They lack a definitive final outcome or solution, and they have no conceivable stopping point. So they must be continually addressed. And we see this over and over again with locusts because they still exist. There's still problems happening because of these locusts.
It's not like you're ever going to get to a point facing the locust problem where you say, now it's solved, we don't have to worry about locust outbreaks at all. You can find maybe ways to mitigate it or to deal with the problem, but you really can't there's no goal that we work toward. There's no way to stop the problem. It's always going to be something that we have to work on to keep at bay.
Right.
And then I think another problem is that wicked problems are really, really complex, and sometimes they're so complex that we can't fully grasp them. And so you can have lots and lots of people working on it. They all are pretty well, they all have pretty good knowledge base about the aspect of the problem that they are working on, but they're not capable of having enough knowledge to look at the whole system and to understand the whole system.
We had this preconceived idea that it was this biological factor, but then researchers come in and they realize that there's a human component that is creating more locust swarms, and not just climate change, but overgrazing fields and all of these different ways that we have now seen in the way that it's more complicated. But there are also factors that we aren't even aware of yet, that we haven't even seen yet.
Right, and then the final characteristic of wicked problems is that they're often controversial. And so this is a real barrier to trying to solve them, because what solution you come up with for your community that your community approves of might actually be opposed by another community. And this is a problem for locusts in particular because they have such huge swarms and they impact so many diverse countries and so many diverse people. Coming up with a solution that everybody can get behind, coming up with a strategy that everybody can work toward is almost impossible.
Right, yeah. And so another part of the locust problem is that it's controversial in the way that we approach sustainability problems from an ethical perspective. Is it ethical to, eradicate locusts? What kind of right do we as humans have to manipulate environmental biological systems? That can be seen as very controversial. And so climate change is obviously a wicked problem. It is very controversial. And one of the solutions for climate change that has been proposed by scientists is the releasing of sulfur into the atmosphere. That would definitely help curb the effects of climate change, but it kind of gets into this point of then we can control the weather, then we can control how our climate feels. Do you want it to be 70 degrees in the summer? We can make that happen if we release more sulfur. And so what is the ethic behind dealing with these environmental problems? Where is the line that we have to draw here?
Yeah, it seems like you have a real challenge when it comes to approaching solutions for wicked problems, because you can never really pinpoint how this solution is going to impact all of the stakeholders or how that solution might affect the entire system. And so you end up with these really complicated and sometimes devastating unintended consequences that make the problem really, really difficult to solve. And so you interviewed one of the ASU scientists who works with wicked problems. Tell us about what you learned from him.
Sure. For our little short Wicked Problems, Wicked Fast, I interviewed David Manuel Navarrete, who is a sustainability scientist with the Global Institute of Sustainability, and he does his research in Mexico City on some wetlands there and their use. And his take on wicked problems is very fascinating, and we have a sound clip of him.
Problems that are not wicked are problems that we can solve. And the way we go about solving these problems is by first creating some distance between us and the problem. So we become external observers, and then we can analyze the problem and solve it. Now, wicked problems are a completely different animal. The only way we can address wicked problems is by actually immersing ourselves into the problem. We have to really look inside and see the wicked problem in us before we can do anything and engage anyone into addressing that problem. Now that has huge implications for the way we teach sustainability, because we have to create the skills or the practice in the students to actually immerse themselves at a personal level into the situation before they can address it.
That's a really interesting insight into how to solve sustainability problems, because I think scientists in general tend to want to remain objective and removed from the objects that they study. And what David is saying is that in order to really understand sustainability problems, wicked problems, you actually have to become immersed in that situation. You have to put yourself in the middle of that wicked problem and start to interact with people and learn what their values are, learn how they're being impacted, understand the system from inside instead of from this removed objective position that a traditional scientist might like to approach.
So one of the things that I love that David said is we have to really look inside and see the wicked problem in us. And so I think that's especially relevant to sustainability work, because we collectively have created this problem. And so recognizing our role in it and how our role can be used to solve it is highly important in wicked problems.
Yeah, and there's many good examples of this. If you just think about your relationship to consumerism and all of the products that you buy and all of the things that you end up throwing out because you don't need them anymore and it's just cheaper to throw them away and buy something new, right? that consumerism, extractive natural resources, and overuse of natural resources is all wrapped up in your own personal behavior. There's so many ways that you personally contribute to that problem that unless you recognize how you are a part of that system, you can't make it clear to others, why they need to change or how they need to work to promote sustainability.
Right, and I think that also goes into this idea that David has talked about before, not in this podcast, but this idea of us versus them. When we approach some problems, we tend to have very polarizing effects. You are causing this problem, I am trying to help. But really, when we get down to it, we are all collectively a part of the problem. And so, in a way, it's kind of exciting because we can all be part of the solution as well.
Yeah, and I think this is a great place to end for this week's first run at sustainability and locusts. And so next week, we're going to take a look at how you can analyze a sustainability problem. We'll be talking with Dr. Ariane Cease, who's a researcher here at the School of Sustainability. So we'll be talking with Dr. Cease about her research into the locust problem and about how she goes about analyzing sustainability problems to try to understand and come up with solutions that work for everybody in the community.
Another part of Dr. Cease's work that I really love is that it kind of is born from a place of personal passion. It was kind of born out of her experience in the Peace Corps in Senegal when she experienced a locust swarm and then saw the devastation that occurred in the community that she was working in. And that is what has inspired her to take on this research and this wicked problem.
Excellent. So we'll see you guys next week. If you have any questions or concerns, feel free to email Molly or me. Our contact information is in the Blackboard site for this course. Take it easy.
Thanks.